you have a piece of pizza, you listen to a piece of music, somebody touches your skin nice, and you feel some pleasure. But once that's over, you're back to where your life was before. How you feel about your life. Are you interested in life? Do you have skills? How do you feel about yourself? Do you have people that love you? What's going on for you in your life? And I think it's really important to break down for kids the difference between happiness and pleasure. And you go into high school classroom and you say to kids, what do you understand is the difference between high school and pleasure? Believe me, they can talk about the difference. One is short-lived, one comes from the outside, the other comes from the inside. And I think it's important for our youth today because they're sold so much instant pleasure that they begin to forget that they don't come to school for pleasure, but they do come to school to put a life together for happiness. I call that the difference between serotonin and dopamine. And we'll just go on from there. Second piece that I want to get to that is important is the hippocampus. And this was particularly interesting and important for me as a teacher. I was a math teacher for many years. And you know, and the kids that would smoke weed all the time, you know, there was something about it that they weren't handling it all quite right. And once I began to understand the hippocampus, things begin to make sense to me. And here's what the hippocampus does, real simply. It pulls up information from long-term memory that you need at a particular moment in time. If I was teaching about percents, I would want kids to pick up what they already knew about fractions and what they knew about decimals, so that that would be part of the conversation, and they would have that when I started to teach about percents. The second thing is, and the hippocampus is what does that, the second thing is that if I taught the lesson well and something really stuck and it was, oh, this is important, then the hippocampus would take that and put that into long-term memory. And the other thing the hippocampus does is get rid of stuff that isn't important. So it begins to make the distinction between the two. So let me give you an example. You go to pick up an apple and take a bite out of an apple. If you bit into the apple and the apple tasted like a pear, you would kind of freak for a second. What's going on? Why? The reason is because you expected the apple to taste like an apple. You've had red apples, green apples, yellow apples. You have a whole memory of apples, so that the hippocampus is what brings that up, even though you're not thinking of it consciously. If you smoke marijuana and the hippocampus is interfered with and you take a bite out of the apple, you have a tendency to go, whoa, man, I may have had a lot of apples in my life, but man, you got to taste this apple because this apple is special. You know something? It's almost like I never tasted an apple before. There's a way in which the apple seems fresh and new. You do that with a piece of music. You go someplace that you've been to 100 times, but if you go and you're high on marijuana, all of a sudden it seems fresh and new. The reason that it feels fresh and new is because the hippocampus is interrupted in the work that it normally does. So it's not pulling from long-term memory, so you kind of it seems like everything is fresh and new. The other thing is that it doesn't distinguish between what's important and what isn't. So everything is kind of important and really deep, and then it kind of floats away. And the third thing it does is it doesn't put things into long-term memory. So simply said, as a teacher, is it interferes with learning. And my concern with marijuana is once the marijuana wears off, it takes a while for that hippocampus to come back to full working order.
Now, Ralph, you're doing just fine, but you only have 4 minutes.
Okay, we'll do it in 4 minutes. And so we're drawing from long-term information, puts it away. Last thing I want to talk about is the cerebellum. And the cerebellum is simple. What the cerebellum does, it handles coordination. And all marijuana really does for the cerebellum is it slows things down. So now what we have is a drug that releases dopamine, that interferes with long-term memory so things seem fresh and new, and you slow down. The last thing that I want to say in terms of, for some people here, if we're just normal range and you smoke marijuana, it can make things more interesting or give some pleasure. But I want to say that for some people who are more in the more bored range or in a negative state or feeling kind of down, and they smoke marijuana, and it jumps them all the way up to this area. That's a big, big difference. That's when marijuana works really well for somebody. And so if marijuana, and I used to have kids that would say to me, Mr. Cantor, can I get into your math class after lunch? Because if I can, I could smoke a doobie during lunchtime, and then I can come into your class and I can learn so much better. And I thought, what are you talking about? You can learn better when you're on marijuana? But I thought about it for those kids, particularly the kids that were a little attention deficit disorder, were unhappy in school anyway, and here they come into my class, and all of a sudden they can finally chill because the marijuana really has slowed them down some, so they can just sit in the class. They're releasing some dopamine, so they feel pretty good in the class now, and I start teaching about 2s and 3s, and they're fascinated. Wow, I never really thought about 2s and 3s that way before. So for them, they really feel like they're learning better. So, for people where marijuana really works, you know, and it doesn't really work for everybody, it creates euphoria, but for some people, it releases some dopamine. For other people, it can release an enormous amount of dopamine. There's an old Gary Larson joke that where there's two gorillas eating bananas, and one gorilla says,